Okay, we're going to look at some of the historical developments of federalism. And we know that federalism from the founding of the Republic till about 1937 was in a form that we call dual federalism. State governments and the national government remained supreme within their own spheres, and the powers and policy assignments of the layers of government were rather distinct, as in a layer cake. So the states didn't get involved in federal issues, and the federal government didn't get involved in state issues for the most part. Now we know that the commerce controversy in Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824 points out the fact that it was very difficult to separate national from state jurisdiction. It wasn't easy. And by the time we get to the 1930s, the separation between the state and national government proves to be virtually impossible, which pushes dual federalism out of the scene, and we move into what we call cooperative federalism. Now, historically, dual federalism was interpreted as one in which the national government did not exercise a great deal of power. And this was actually supported by the Supreme Court, who up until the 1880s supported a laissez-faire, let business do what business wants to do, and we will all benefit. And they actually applied from the Civil War until the 1880s the 14th Amendment to support big business and its actions. So they constantly, when states, progressive states especially, tried to invalidate the role that big business was playing, and they would pass regulations to regulate big business, the Supreme Court would declare them unconstitutional. Now, that was less true after 1887, when the Interstate Commerce Commission was established, but the commission itself was rather weak. And so dual federalism is actually pushed out by what we call circumstances, and the circumstances were the Great Depression of the 1930s. So during this era, during this short era of the 1929 to 1937, the state and federal government cooperated in solving the common complex problems that were ushered in by the Great Depression. And the New Deal programs, starting in 1933, often involved joint action between the national government and the states. So we can see now where there is an ending to dual federalism, and there is an adoption of what we call cooperative federalism, which means that the national government is involved to some extent in virtually all public policy making. So the two types of federalism, again, are often compared by using an analogy with two types of cakes: the layer cake, equaling dual federalism, with its clearly distinct separations, and the marble cake, or what we call cooperative federalism, where the two intertwine and swirl together. Now there's a third type of what we call fiscal federalism, and you can see here that the fiscal federalism basically involves the pattern of spending and taxing and providing grants in the federal system. It has become the cornerstone of the relationship between the national government and the state and local governments. So we can see here income security would be things like Social Security, disability, things like that. Health would be certainly Medicare. Transportation would be interstate highways, so on and so forth. And we can also see where fiscal federalism has had an important impact upon the states as the federal government increases its largesse to the states using grants. Now that allows us to now go over the, sorry about that brain glitch, now go over the types of grants that exist within the system. And the first one we're going to look at will be categorical grants. But we have to say first, what are grants? Well, grants are money that the national government gives to the state and local governments to administer programs that are federally funded. Hence, they're called federal grants. And the purpose of them are to keep the federal government from growing itself, but that means that the bureaucracy increases at both the state and the local levels. But even more importantly, it supplies state and local governments with needed revenue. And we've seen how important that is since 2007. It also establishes minimum federal standards in important areas. The government giveth in one instance, but they taketh away in the other, because states can no longer operate the way they had before without federal oversight. If you receive the money, you've got to have a little bit of federal oversight behind you. And there's also an attempt to equalize resources among the rich and poor states, California and New York, let's say on one hand, and Mississippi and Arkansas on the other hand. That means that there's income transfers from the rich states, California, New York, to the poor states, Arkansas, Mississippi. So that in general is what grants are supposed to do. Now the first type of grant that we'll look at are what we call categorical grants. And categorical grants are appropriated by Congress for specific purposes: highway or airport building, welfare, school lunches, etc. These grants usually require the state to match or put up money. Now sometimes it is 50-50, sometimes it's 80-20. And so the matching funds for these categorical grants can vary widely per state and for whatever the federal government is interjecting money into. Now there are hundreds of categorical grants, but a few, including Medicare and aid to families with dependent children. I grew up with AFDC. It's now TANF, and something for needy families, and I can't remember what the T and the A stands for. And because of the giganticness of these two programs, they account for almost 85% of the total spending for categorical grants. Just those two things. And state and local officials complain that these grants are often too narrow and cannot be adapted easily to meet local needs, because it's assumed that the poor in South Carolina or Mississippi need exactly the same things as the poor in, let's say, Milwaukee or Chicago, even though they live in very different circumstances. You have to treat them and appropriate the money in the same way, and it doesn't quite work. And so categorical grants are still extremely important. They may still be in the majority, and in fact I think they are, because Democrats have been in charge, and frankly Democrats like categorical grants. Republicans, as we'll see, like block grants. The states like block grants, but the cities like categorical grants. Go figure. Now, before we get to block grants, we have to look at project grants. And project grants are a little bit different. The states apply to grants for specific projects. And that has created a cottage industry of grant writers who know how to write grants and write grants successfully, because if you manage to do that, you can probably have a job for life. And organizations, many times, seek money from the government to accomplish things at the local or state level. And that's what project grants do. In fact, this district, in its original laptop program, that was a project grant from the federal government, I believe. Now, block grants consolidate several categorical grants into what we call a single block. And these single block grants are prescribed for broad activities such as social services, health services, public education. Now, this type of grant was promoted by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And during the early 1980s, Congress consolidated a number of categorical grants into block grants, and they became very popular with the states. Later presidents have advocated that more consolidation occur, but Congress has been reluctant to do so because Congress likes to keep its hooks into programs that they appropriate money for. So, and the other reason, of course, is that block grants give Congress less control over how the money is spent and is used. And even more importantly, because we know we have a lot of prima donnas in Congress, when you have a block grant, a representative cannot take credit for the grants to their particular district. Now, state governments have generally supported block grants because they give states wide latitude on how and where the money is spent. City mayors, on the other hand, tend to oppose them because cities must rely on the state governments now to determine the funding and the rules as to how that money will be spent. So it's weird how we maneuver back and forth between the block and everything else. Now, today, even though block grants still exist, Congress is always tempted to add strings to the money, or to set requirements, and that means setting requirements for how federal grants are to be spent, etc., etc. So as a result, block grants gradually become more categorical, a phenomenon known as a creeping categorization. Now there's one other type I'd like to talk about before we move on to a couple of the other things, and that is what we call revenue sharing. Now revenue sharing is it's a dinosaur because it doesn't exist anymore. Revenue sharing was popular in the 70s and into the early 80s. It started with Nixon, it ended with Reagan and what we call New Federalism. And there was in this case, a general grant of money to the states detached. And that meant that they had a lot more leeway than block grants. And it was associated with Nixon and Reagan and what we call New Federalism, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. But revenue sharing no longer exists because in the military buildup of the 1980s, any revenue that there was to share was gone because we were now running budget deficits. And so therefore revenue sharing means that there's revenue left over after you've paid all the bills. There wasn't any in this case. So let's review this. The Democrats have generally favored greater funding but with more strings, otherwise known as categorical grants. The GOP have generally favored less funding but with fewer strings, what we call block grants. So remember those two, Democrats, categorical, GOP, block. Now, let's look at how one major program has been affected by the switch from categorical to block. Welfare is an example. Now, welfare begins in the 1960s as part of the Great Society programs put together by Johnson to combat poverty. And what Republicans wanted to do was, and a lot of states wanted to do, was to end the entitlement status of AFDC and the federal guarantee of welfare checks. And it took them 3 tries, but the third time was a charm in the passage in 1996 of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Now, welfare block grants, based on the law, replaced the welfare categorical grants. And that meant that the states were deciding how they would spend the money. And there were a number of changes in the law. So the federal strings were reduced, but as we see down here at the bottom, there was a federal string involved in that states must spend at least 75% of what they had previously spent on welfare before the law was introduced. And so that meant that there was no race to the bottom. But the big changes were that no federal funds would go to recipients who had not worked within 2 years. And that meant long time welfare recipients would get nothing more, theoretically. And secondly, no federal funds would go to recipients who have received federal money for the last 5 years, which meant that you had to get off your duff and find some work. Now in the 1990s, that was actually fairly easy because the unemployment rate was at historic lows, as the ability to figure out what to do with the internet and all begin to kick in, and personal computers, and they all begin to kick in. The states have been used as laboratories, and many states copied Tommy Thompson and Wisconsin's welfare law framework, which I think in Wisconsin meant that some 70 to 80% of those who had been on welfare prior to the law, or prior to Wisconsin introducing reform, were now working. But they found that there were problems with the programs, that many of these people who had been on welfare had children, and that the state was having to spend a considerable amount of money on child care and things like that. But it was figured that these people being... Now, we can see here that there's a lot of diversity when it comes to federal payments. California is one of the larger ones. I know it says 90, but your book should have said 900. It's green down here. On average, I'm sorry, 5 to 599. This is a different shade of green. But we can also see that in places like Texas and in South Carolina, $183 a month, $154 a month. Some people think that's a sacrilege, but since, like people in my family, have made their life as one that lives off the public dole, some states, especially in the South and the West, have made it very difficult to be on the public dole. It was only meant to be a safety net until you got another job. It was never meant to become what it did become, which was for many people a generational thing. But we can see that there's wide variations. This is a good example of federalism, how each state is responsible for its own citizens in a way that it feels comfortable with. Now again, let's go back and look at fiscal federalism just one more time. There's approximately $460 billion in grants every year, and that actually is probably much larger. I think this is from the mid-2000s. And what we do know also is that grant distribution follows universalism. It's a little something for everybody. But that means that we have what's called mandate blues, because mandates direct states or local governments to comply with federal laws and federal rules under threat of penalty. And they cannot get the money unless they obey all of the government rules, no matter how ridiculous they are. And then even worse than that, there's what we call unfunded mandates, but we're going to stick with that, or leave this for now until we get to the actual look at mandates. But unfunded mandates is simply what it sounds like. The federal government says, you're going to do this, but guess what? We're not going to pay for it. Bastards. Now, this is another example of, this is out of your book too, the ADA spending per child. We can see that that in California we spend approximately $7,800, and this was based on 2006 figures. Texas was actually spending almost as much as we were, but then you got states like Utah spending $5,600. And then on the other hand, you got these other states like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or, God forbid, District of Columbia, spending almost $15,000 per student and getting the kind of results which indicate that you're spending maybe $2,000. They have a rotten teachers union. There's good teachers there, but, you know, really? Really? Sad. Now, mandates. Let's get into these a little bit more. Sorry for the length of this, but this is the way it is. A federal order imposed upon the states is what we call a mandate. So a mandate is represented by sometimes laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which required that you have entry into buildings, extra large bathrooms to accommodate those in wheelchairs, etc., etc. It also meant that you had clean air, clean water, in which the federal government was telling states to clean up their act. The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts started in the 1960s, and some facsimile of those laws are still in effect today. And then we have something like the individual design. And the purpose of any of these mandates is to meet a goal of the federal government. We want you to do this. We might come up with some money for it, we might not. It's according to what we want to do. Much of this stuff is actually worthy because disabled Americans need to have access to buildings. They need to be accommodated in bathrooms and things like that. But at some point, you have, as Clint Eastwood found in Carmel, California, you have conflicting laws. Part of the town is been declared an historical landmark, and therefore the law says you can't change anything. At the same time, because many of these buildings are old, their doorways and things are of the size that they can't admit wheelchairs and things. And so the city itself was sued while Clint Eastwood was mayor of Carmel. And I'm not quite sure how it all worked out at the time because that was probably 20, 25 years ago, but it has been an issue. Now, what is the impact upon the states? Well, the ADA, for instance, the American with Disabilities Act, has imposed large costs upon the states as they make, or they're supposed to make, reasonable accommodations for the disabled. But the disabled have pushed and pushed and pushed, sometimes unfairly, and so the term reasonable accommodations can be very not clear. I guess I know a better word in my vocabulary, but it's really not clear. Or it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so when it says reasonable accommodations, many of these things have wound up in the courts, and the courts decide what a reasonable accommodation is. There's also complaints from the states that the federal government is heavy-handed in this. They're imposing this, they're imposing that, and they're not willing to pay for it. The states complain about federal blackmail. So for instance, the federal government said that they would no longer provide money for highways unless the states uniformly moved their drinking age to 21. And the states, stuck their tail between their legs, and all of them moved up their drinking age to 21, and now the money began to flow from the federal government again for highways. And it can be said that the federal government is altering federalism with an excessive use of power. I think that's also definitely true. Now, the Republicans decided that they'd had enough with these mandates, primarily coming from the other party, and they passed the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995, which is part of the Contract with America, which we will look at in future units. And theoretically, this was supposed to restrict future unfunded mandates. And this required the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, to analyze the impact of unfunded mandates on the states. And it also required separate congressional votes on bills that imposed unfunded mandates. The goal to this was to perhaps embarrass the opponents or those who are promoting bills which required the states to pay without the federal government coming up with any money. Now, this is another example of what we call the devolution revolution that was associated with the 104th Congress, and we're getting to what all that means in a minute. Now, there are some non-constitutional reasons for the triumph of the national approach. The U.S. government or the U.S. country is huge in size and population. There's over 300 million of us, and we are, along with Canada, basically continent-sized. And so we have the kind of large problems that only a national government can handle. And our problems tend to be more national and even international in scope. Things like pollution, crime, terrorism requires a larger government. And we now have, of course, an improved communication and transportation network, and we have also historical developments. The New Deal, World War II, Great Society have all pushed the federal government into a bigger role. But there were some changes in federalism, as we'll see. By the end of the 1970s, there was a general consensus that the government had gone too far in developing the type of programs that were there to help the poor. Spending was going, but people didn't seem to think that they were getting bang for the buck. And we also started going through a period in which in which many of the presidents, in fact 4 out of the last 6, and now 5 out of the last 7, have been outsiders. Though we could say Obama was an insider because he was a senator, but he only served a partial term. Before that, he did come from the outside. And there's been a lot of reaction and a lot of questioning about the effectiveness of federal programs. They're just not very good in many cases. So for instance, Head Start. Even the government's own studies say that for the vast number of people, Head Start doesn't work. And in fact, Head Start, except for a very, very small group of children, the effects of Head Start are gone by the 3rd grade. And yet, we keep funding it on a yearly basis. It's pretty amazing. There's also a reaction against big government because of, first and foremost, California's tax revolt. California's Prop 13 in 1978 was a big wake-up call for both state and federal governments about spending. People wanted a reduction of the Great Society-style programs that you learned about in AP U.S. history and U.S. history. And again, people question the effectiveness of those programs. So, since the 1980s, we've had a love-affair, love-hate reaction against the federal government. We've seen a reduction of Great Society federal aid to cities. We've seen the elimination of revenue sharing. We've seen a reduction of categorical grants, even though we have the creeping categorization of them. We've seen increased use of block grants. We have a reduction of federal regulations. Not enough, though. We had the 1996 welfare reform bill, and we've had restrictions on unfunded mandates. All well and good. But we have, to finish this up, just a discussion a little bit about New Federalism and the devolution revolution. Now, New Federalism is simply about shifting some authority from the national government back to the states. And it was, again, associated with Nixon and Reagan, but it was especially associated with the 104th Congress, which was elected in 1994, and the 105th Congress, which was elected in 1996. These were both Republican Congresses, and they came up with a term called devolution revolution, which was returning power back to the states, returning money back to the states, lowering taxes, getting rid of regulations, and so on. After the welfare reform bill was passed in 1996, Clinton himself said the era of big government is over. Aha, we've seen that that's not true. During his time, there was the welfare reform bill, there was the repeal of the 55-mile-an-hour limit on speeds, there was the restrictions again of future unfunded mandates, there were more block grants, there were less categorical grants, there were tax cuts under both Clinton and Bush 43. However, even the GOP Congresses, especially under Bush 43, increased national power. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq led to huge military spending increases. We've had massive budget deficits from both Bush 43 and Obama. The U.S. Patriot Act of 2002 vastly increased federal power. We are now seeing some of that with the NSA spying on us. And the NCLB, which is the Labor Relations Board that the government has imposed, NCLB, thinking of something else, No Child Left Behind, imposed significant burdens on the state, which is why it's going out of fashion. So this is our look at federalism. There'll be one more loaded up tomorrow, and that will be on Federalist 51, because you will be doing Federalist 51 in this section, and I want to analyze that, or help you analyze that and understand it before you embark upon the rather difficult assignment I have for you this week. This is advanced placements, so sometimes things are easier or harder than others, and this will be one of the harder ones. So this is the end of Lecture 12, the origins of American federalism and recent developments in American federalism.